Welcome to the Procurement Software Podcast, where we aim to educate and inspire you about how technology is changing and shaping our profession. The truth is, there's never been a more exciting time to be in procurement, but only if you're one of those organizations that's embracing the change and driving new developments. And this podcast is all about giving you the tools to help you get there. So buckle up and let's get right into this week's show. Yes, hello. Very warm welcome to another episode of the Procurement Software Podcast. And today we're actually going to be tackling a topic that is a little bit underrepresented in the procurement tech space. We're talking about direct materials, specifically about chemicals and raw material sourcing. And my guest today is Dheev Arulmani, who is the COO, co-founder of Valdera. Welcome, Dheev.
James, thanks for having me. Excited for the chat.
Yeah, and I love what you're doing, actually, because I'm an ex-direct materials category manager or buyer from back in the day when I started out. So Valdera is an AI-powered sourcing platform built specifically for chemicals and raw materials, connecting buyers and suppliers across 130 different countries. You co-founded Valdera with your sister, Sruti, back in 2021. And you've both got quite interesting backgrounds. So you're ex-McKinsey, and she's ex-investment banking, but you both studied chemical engineering, if I'm not mistaken. So both of these are very different to industrial manufacturing. So I wanted to start out actually just by asking you, and also pulling in from Sruti's experience as well, what did you see inside those companies sort of earlier on in your career that made you think that the market fundamentally needed something different for chemicals and raw materials procurement?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you could speak the language as a category manager yourself. I think, as a chemical engineer myself, I started in the lab, everything from batteries, membranes, quantum dots. Love getting my hands dirty. But most recently, I was at McKinsey in their chem and ag practice, doing a lot of supply chain and procurement transformations for large manufacturers, companies in the chemicals industry, pharma, crop science, and so forth. And one thing that was very obvious at the time is that this is a massive, massive industry, $6 trillion. It goes into literally everything we touch. It's super fragmented. There are hundreds of thousands of suppliers globally, and it's extremely antiquated how these companies source materials, get market intelligence, really deeply manage thousands and tens of thousands of materials that they're owning. We literally have, $50 billion companies that are Googling suppliers and manually comparing spec sheets and cold emailing for data. And we thought, hey, there's got to be a way to use AI and data science to modernize that entire workflow. The idea was actually Shruti's from her venture capital background. Her thesis was on supply chain for manufacturers, and she investigated many startups and technology companies in the space and realized that nobody was really going after the chemicals and raw materials industry. And that was really the inception behind the idea of Valdera. And we started the business really focused on the sourcing pain point itself right at the peak of COVID. And since then, we've really expanded to much more of a full end-to-end AI operating system for a chemical and raw material category manager.
So what industries then would you typically see, and sort of size of companies as well as your typical avatar?
Well, I like to say that chemicals and raw materials, these are the mother of all industries, right? It's literally everything we touch somehow or another is derived from these types of inputs, whether that is on the consumer side, if you're talking about manufacturers of home care, personal care, cosmetics, food and beverage. Obviously, there's a big pharma and life science vertical. If you're thinking about, that broader industry, there's a big focus on industrial manufacturers. If you think about building materials, advanced materials, large industrial processes that are very chemical intensive. And then, of course, last but not least, the biggest one are chemical companies sourcing chemicals, right? This is a big part of the value proposition, is helping those types of manufacturers find the right inputs for their sourcing flows.
So it really is a pretty broad spectrum then from the chemical sort of OEMs themselves, right, the way through to industrial manufacturing, consumer goods, pharma, life sciences, and so on and so forth. Cool. Okay. Well, chemicals are pretty complex and they can't be classified like a standard product. And you can have the same base chemical essentially with 40 different grades, certifications, regulatory requirements, depending on the end application. I'm not a chemicals expert, but this is what, doing a bit of research, what the internet told me. So how much of Valdera's value is solving that, essentially the upstream data problem before any of the sourcing activity even starts, in terms of specification gathering?
If you think about the world of procurement, right, there's a lot of inputs into procurement, such as indirects, like software or travel or insurance, or even on the direct side, finished goods like pipes or fittings or pumps. These are finished goods with specific SKUs attached to them. But when you start getting into the world of chemicals and raw materials, this is a whole different beast, right? You have an infinite permutation of specifications. You have different chemical structures, different properties, different regulatory requirements, different safety requirements, different logistics needs. You have to build the data infrastructure from the ground up for these types of materials. Everything from how they're classified, the taxonomy around it, how specifications are captured, how regulation applies to different industries. So when we started Valdera, we were very much a data science company. We wanted to build the largest data set of chemical specifications, supplier catalogs, trade flows, all this information globally. And we did that over the first couple of years of building Valdera. We've mapped about 1.7 million cast numbers and 400,000 suppliers globally. What's made it really compelling over the last couple of years is being able to use one of these AI capabilities on top of that to drive agentic flows and really expand the power of that data through AI.
I'm glad that you've given me that backdrop, because the next thing that I wanted to sort of segue into is a lot of these legacy generic procurement platforms, I'm not going to name them, but anyone listening to this can probably guess who I'm talking about, claim to be able to handle all spend. And with that backdrop of how chemicals and raw material sourcing typically is, with a lot of the background intel that goes into like building a sourcing event, walk me through why a lot of these generic legacy all-in-one source-to-pay, source-to-contract platforms, where do they fall down when they try and handle a category like this?
Yeah, if you think about the procurement technology world, right? I mean, you're talking about these one-size-fits-all suites. Historically, they've taken a very much horizontal approach to this industry, right? How do we become the best category management platform? How do we become the best market intelligence platform across categories? How do we become the best sourcing platform? How do we become the best negotiation platform? And have taken a horizontal approach in the sense that they're trying to take a one-size-fits-all approach for indirects, directs, chemicals, raw materials, every single category that exists. A big part of our vision is how do you actually flip the script a little bit and take a deeply vertically integrated approach and say you pick a specific category like chemicals and raw materials that is so complex, so fragmented across many different levers. And how do you build that entire workflow all the way from ingesting the raw spend and really creating a control tower with all the repository of materials, specs, spend, suppliers, contracts, applying an external market intelligence layer to lean out where there's interesting opportunities. And once you find those opportunities, how do you actually go to market on those and capture the value? So we're taking much more of a deeply vertically integrated approach for the chemical and raw material industry, because the reality is that, sourcing them, managing the market intelligence for them, and actually driving that impact needs to be done in a very, very different way than indirects.
So if I was to summarize that then in one sentence, it's really the activity in Valdera starts a lot further upstream than the classic create sourcing event button in, insert name of legacy source to contract, source to pay suite.
Exactly. You need to create an internal visibility to what you're actually sourcing and what you're managing, not just the materials, but all the way down to the specifications, the price trends, price variance, supplier risk, all of these things. Then you need to be able to apply the external lens of what's actually happening in the market, which is extremely challenging for a category manager to do when they're owning hundreds of materials, thousands of materials, to actually figure out, hey, of the 500 materials that I'm owning, these are the 5 that I should be focused on today because there's something interesting going on in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got a problem in procurement right now, particularly if we look at direct spend, that we've got an aging workforce and typically experienced category managers that have deep category expertise are retiring faster than younger graduates are coming into the profession and managing those categories. It's even more acute in Europe if you look at our demographics than it is in North America. But I mean, the problem's the same across all the developed world. When a person that has that deep category expertise leaves, what does that potentially cost that company then in the lost experience that employee is walking out of the door with?
It's a great question, because if you look at many of our customers, not just in Europe, but globally, the category managers of these sophisticated categories like raw materials, chemicals, oftentimes they're PhDs with really deep chemicals knowledge. They've been doing it for 20 years. They have really deep relationships in the industry. They know the market of a lot of these materials really deeply. But with the new generation of procurement talent that's coming in, not many of them have that deep chemical knowledge, but they have this incredible capability to be agile and use technology and leverage AI in a much more rapid and effective way. So our big vision is, how do you give this new generation of talent the technical know-how and data and information to marry with their digital prowess to actually drive value in a very sophisticated way? And I think the market is moving drastically because there is a shortage of that type of technical talent in the market as the technology and procurement talent pool evolves.
Yeah. So if you have then, for example, a senior category lead with 10 plus years of experience that's maybe honed that experience on indirects or perhaps in other areas of direct spend, they say castings, forgings, purchase parts, and then moving into a role doing chemicals procurement, how could Valdera help them become an effective category lead without having a degree in chemical engineering or that specific category expertise?
It's really coming down to a few different things, right? It's one, understanding your spend and what matters. You know, when you look at a sophisticated material, let's say acetonitrile or pentaerythritol, these aren't generic materials. You need to understand, what are the properties that really matter? What is the supply risk of sourcing in Europe versus Asia versus North America from a supply chain perspective? What are the logistics? What are the tariff implications of some of these things? How these materials get classified in HS codes is very complex. So there's one part of this which is really deeply understanding the materials that you're managing from a technical perspective, from a market perspective, from a logistics and tariffs perspective. The second piece is actually understanding what's happening in the market, right? Are prices moving up or down? What are the supply demand dynamics? Who are the big players? How is capacity affecting pricing today? What are the trends? You know, what are my competitors paying for the same material? It's understanding what's happening externally. And the real power to these procurement managers is being able to marry that internal and external lens to say, hey, this is a material where there's a gap to the market as far as what we're currently doing. And I need to go take action on this. I need to go to market. I need to go discover suppliers. I need to go renegotiate. It's marrying that internal and external view to prioritize and then actually going and taking action on it.
Got it. So if I play devil's advocate and say, okay, what's preventing me from using the deep research function in an LLM to go and do some research on supplier discovery or the different properties and chemistries of the different types of chemicals or raw materials that a category manager would potentially need to go out and tender. How do you keep what you've got as data sources current? What differentiates you from just a generic web scraping tool, essentially, which is essentially what these LLMs are doing, right, when they do their deep research? You know, because you've got the quality of the underlying data that you've got to be responsible for if you're charging people for an end-to-end vertical platform that's very focused on one specific category. So walk me through that a little bit.
Maybe this is a little provocative, but the generic LLMs do an incredible job on the indirect side, but they miss the ball when it comes to chemicals and raw materials. The reason being that these models are trained on publicly available data, right? And the reality is that there isn't much really deeply insightful, publicly available data in the chemical and raw material industry. So if you go to a Claude or a ChatGPT or Gemini, and you're trying to get really deep understanding of markets for specific materials, they're not able to get to that level of detail. The magic behind what we're doing, what's been the real unlock for us, is the proprietary data that we're feeding into these models in order to actually extract insights for specific chemicals and raw materials. So this is a combination of different things. A lot of it is private data that we have directly from suppliers who are willing to share catalog material, specifications, inventory pricing, all kinds of information with us that isn't publicly available. There's a lot of data that we're buying privately from governments, Border Patrol, different agencies, logistics, tariffs companies, canals, and other sources that we're feeding into our models. And of course, we have a lot of intelligence based on the actual feedback that we're seeing on the platform from specific suppliers and buyers as well on what capabilities that they offer. So the real unlock for us has been using the capabilities of these large language models and applying it on top of this massive data set that we've built specific to this industry.
So let's say someone buys the platform, they install it, implement it, get onboarded. 6 months into that journey, what does their category management process and sourcing strategy process look like versus what they were doing before?
It's a good question. Today, if you think about a category manager, say that they're managing 500 materials, right? They have a really strong grasp of those top few strategic materials that they know the market better than anybody. The remaining 450 materials often sit unaddressed or get addressed once every year or 2 years. The magic behind what we're doing is that we are ingesting all of those materials, all 500 of them, mapping it to our market data and surfacing where things are happening. Hey, you're single sourced on this material, the market is moving down, and by the way, your contract is coming up for renewal in 3 months. Somebody should go look at this. So the real shift in the workflow for a category manager is that we are helping them prioritize which materials to look at when, what's actually driving it based on our market intelligence, and then from there, actually digitizing the sourcing workflow, right? Instead of them manually trying to figure out who are the suppliers out there that offer this specification, trying to figure out who the salesperson is, reaching out to them, getting those quotes, manually estimating the tariffs, the logistics, the spec, and comparing the specifications. We're digitizing that entire workflow end to end when they're actually running a sourcing event.
So effectively, then it's enabling a finite resource, i.e. one category manager, to be able to actively manage more of the spend or more of the supply base than they would have previously been physically able to do with the time and resource that's available to them.
Exactly. We've done quite a bit of research across our customers, and what we found is that, at least in chemicals and raw materials, most category managers are able to actively manage about 10 to 20% of the number of materials that they're owning. Our goal is to help them actively manage 100% of those materials and help surface those opportunities so that they're going after the opportunities where there's the biggest gap to market.
Okay. We touched on it a little bit a few minutes ago around, how do you differentiate yourself from a more generic LLM function. What would specifically go wrong then when a buyer tries to use a general purpose AI tool for chemical sourcing? I mean, how far can they get? Because I think we both have to acknowledge they're not completely useless and they serve a purpose, and it's better than just a shot in the dark and using Google. But where would they tend to then slip up or fall short?
Where it falls short is when you get beyond really, really commoditized materials, right? These LLMs are trained on publicly available data. So one, there's no specification input that's going into those materials. So if you're looking at polypropylene, great. Yes, if you go into Claude and you're asking Claude, what is the general price of the market for polypropylene? It'll probably give you a rough ballpark on it. But where it falls down is a few things. One is specifications. Specifications, the devil's in the details. What's the packaging? What's the purity? What's the particle size, molecular weight? That's the level of information you need to get to figure out, hey, is my price actually competitive on this material? Because comparing pharma grade propylene glycol is very, very different than comparing industrial grade propylene glycol. So that's one nuance. The second nuance is actually the supplier discovery piece. Very few suppliers publicly list their entire offering online. So it's very tricky to figure out who has the capability to produce a specific material, who's actually producing it today, and who's able to make that spec that I'm actually looking for. The third piece is around tariffs and logistics. Not only do you need to identify these suppliers, you need to figure out, hey, based on different geographic footprints, based on different origin points, what is the landed cost of this material for me based on first mile freight, ocean freight, last mile freight, and based on the HS code of that material, what is the actual tariff that's applied to that? So, all in all, there's just so many nuances when it comes to sourcing these materials that these LLMs aren't able to get to the actual depth. And frankly, I don't think they will ever be able to, because that data is just not publicly available.
Yeah. If it's not publicly available and it's behind a paywall, then I guess just from their business model perspective as well, there aren't enough people actively searching that data to make it viable to put it in. I mean, if it's something way more generic, then yeah, maybe. But this is pretty niche stuff. You mentioned on your website, you report an average of 14% savings across your different customers. And as you touched on actually in the last answer, when you mentioned logistics costs and tariffs and calculating landed costs, that's a big part. That's a big part of being able to report credible savings that our colleagues in finance are going to sign off. So talk to me a little bit about how that's typically calculated, and what would typically then also be the barriers that prevent one of your customers from being able to achieve that average figure?
Chemicals are very challenging in the sense that qualifying a new supplier, qualifying a new source of a material, a new spec, takes anywhere from several months for industrial companies all the way through 1 to 2 years for much more sophisticated applications that are super regulated like pharma or agricultural chemicals. That's a really big challenge that we're working on. The reason we are able to drive that type of savings is two things. One is that we are proactively prioritizing which materials to focus on when. So our goal is not a peanut butter spread approach where we say, hey, run any material and you'll find 14% savings. Our goal is to help category managers figure out what are the materials that have a gap to market, where going to market will actually drive that type of impact. The second piece is the distinction between incumbent savings and alternate supplier savings. When we run an event, we're seeing 3 to 7% savings directly from incumbents that hit the books immediately. From a finance perspective, they'll call it realized to the books today. The rest of the savings that we're identifying are coming from alternate suppliers who are able to meet the spec that you are requesting, where it's not going to be a plug and play switch where I say, great, I'm going to start buying from this supplier tomorrow. That's going to require a little bit of qualification effort, R&D involvement. The key there is helping these teams prioritize which materials will give them the biggest ROI, the biggest bang for the buck for that R&D qualification capacity. Because the reality is that most companies have scarce R&D capacity to go qualify new suppliers of these materials. So where should they actually be focused on to get the biggest ROI in these materials? So, that qualification impact, may take several months to actually hit the books, but arguably much more impactful in the longer term strategy of the business.
Yeah, I've never come across a company that has abundant resources of supplier quality engineers. Yes, I think that's a valid point. And you serve both the buy side and the sell side in the sense that you list suppliers on the platform as part of what you do with supplier discovery. That's not a pay-to-play function, is it? So can you just walk me through how do you balance that potential conflict of interest of having both obviously buyers paying you to be customers of the platform, but then you're also listing suppliers on the website on the platform too?
This is a very important question because the nuance here is that the chemical industry is, one, very, very private about data, and two, this is a relationships industry in general, right? We've believed very firmly that it has to be an independent third party that is able to house the data of the supplier side to do that matchmaking without publicly disclosing the supplier's capabilities and the proprietary formulations, the specs of the buyer. So the important nuance here is that we do not take a cut of any transaction. our entire incentive is we want to match the buyer with a very unique specification and application with the supplier that's able to actually meet those capabilities. So from a supplier perspective, when we're routing a request to them, this is entirely a free lead for that sales organization. So for them, they're looking at a buyer and saying, this is an opportunity for us to build that relationship, build that direct relationship without a distributor or a broker or trader in the middle. So that's the really important piece, is that we are an objective third party in between both sides that isn't directly incentivized to, preference one side or the other. And I think that's the failure mode of many other technologies that have been attempted in the chemicals industry, is that they have leaned too far on one side or the other. So for us, it's very much, how do we build trust across both sides without publicly disclosing their proprietary information?
Okay, so it's from a supplier side, then they see the win-win because they're cutting out any potential commissions, but they're also, it is not in your interest to commercialize that because you want to give the buyer the best possible experience as a customer of the platform.
Exactly. We want to route to any supplier in the world that we think is capable. We don't want that to become a bottleneck for supplier engagement. So when we route a request to a supplier saying, hey, somebody's interested in purchasing this material, it's an entirely free lead for them with the ability to engage with them directly and build that relationship directly.
Okay, so we've spoken a lot about the more sort of theoretical and technical side of the platform and what it can do. Let's talk a little bit about a real life example, because listeners always love to hear this in terms of, are they actually doing it in practice? When we were preparing this, you mentioned a large US pharma company, and we can keep them anonymous if you wish to, that saw some immediate results from a pilot, and they were able to uncover opportunities that their in-house procurement team hadn't previously identified. Assuming that they had a reasonably mature or experienced in-house team, what was it able to do that their in-house team couldn't, or that just didn't have the means and the data at their fingertips to be able to find?
It's a good question. And in this specific use case, we're working with many large pharma companies. But in this specific case, you're talking about tens of billions of dollars in revenue. They're buying billions of dollars of raw materials. They're managing tens of thousands of materials in a highly regulated space where qualification could take months to years. So there was a ton of inherent complexity in the spend that they are managing. And what we did is took a bit of a 3-phase approach to this. First phase being ingest the spend, normalize it into that category manager, where we are creating that control tower of all of that information in one central place. The second thing we did is map that data directly to our market intelligence to benchmark where we thought there was opportunity, right? There are some materials where we said, hey, you're in a very competitive position, nothing to do here. There are some materials where we said, hey, there's a pretty big gap to the market on these specific materials, pricing wise, or the market is moving down or whatever it is. Let's go prioritize those materials that we really want to focus on. So we narrowed in on the scope of materials that we thought were particularly interesting, where there was opportunity. Then we actually went to market. This is the phase 3 where we actually implemented the go-to-market piece of it, where we ran our supplier discovery to actually drive real quotes on these materials. So on average, we're routing to somewhere around 50 to 100 suppliers for each material, generating about 10 to 15 quotes. And this is where that 14% average savings number that we talked about comes in. The reason we're able to drive that is because, one, we're reaching out to a much, much, much broader set of suppliers, probably 5 to 10x what they would typically do. 2, we're getting many more data points globally on what's actually happening in the market. And 3, we're including the actual incumbents in that process as well. So 1, you're building trust with them, but you're also being very transparent with them on what's happening in the market and the competitive pricing that you're seeing as well. So that was really what unlocked the value for this specific client, was our ability to prioritize and actually go to market to extract the value.
And to be able to triage where there's opportunity and where you acknowledge that they're already doing a good job. Yeah.
Because oftentimes there's an internal perception that, hey, there are specific materials where there's a gap, or hey, something's happening in the market. But a lot of this is anecdotal from a category manager or a CPO, where they've heard different data points from different suppliers or competitors or others. But we're trying to put data behind that to say, hey, we actually can see in the market that the pricing has moved down 5% in the last quarter, and you should go look at this.
Yeah. We recently worked on a white paper together. I'm not sure by the time this goes live whether or not it will be published. It's due to go out on the 25th of June. But one of the key findings, if it is live, we'll link to it in the show notes. One of the key findings of that is that if you're working with purpose-built, category-specific software, procurement teams will likely be smaller and less specialist, but with much better marketing intelligence and data, because that's what a platform like Valdera brings to the party. Do you think that there's a ceiling on how much a platform like Valdera can be a substitute for domain-specific expertise? And the second part of that is, what are your thoughts then on the future roles of, in large corporate center of excellence teams, or across the board, external consultants or fractional subject matter experts or interim managers that focus on chemicals and raw materials as their specific area of expertise?
The vision that we have is that we want to be the operating system for a category manager, right? We want to help them 10x the materials that they are actively managing. So what started off as the sourcing piece in particular now has expanded for us into that fully vertically integrated operating system. And where we see the next horizon of Valdera moving towards is much more of an agentic flow on top of a lot of these things to be able to autonomously drive some of that value. But the goal for us is to eliminate a lot of the sort of tedious manual workflows that a category manager is doing to help them focus on the more strategic things around supplier relationships, driving negotiations, thinking about the global footprint and supply risk and other factors, but giving them the data, the prioritization, and the intelligence to do that in a much more sophisticated way across 500 materials, doing what they're doing for those strategic materials across everything.
So one of the key skills that they're going to have to learn, which procurement professionals perhaps don't all have today, is the ability to be able to interpret what AI or what market intelligence is telling them, and then being able to tell that story. I always say this: procurement are terrible at internal comms and marketing, but being able to present that story to the business to get buy-in to their strategies.
You're right. And it's telling that story to a range of different stakeholders, right? It's telling that story, one, to your suppliers and being able to drive those negotiations. Two, to be able to tell that story to your leadership team, whether that's a CPO or the board, to be able to say, hey, look, we have data that indicates that we are competitive on this, or there is a gap that we need to go address. Three, there's a big R&D component to this. To extract the value, you have to partner with R&D and supply chain teams to actually drive the execution of qualifying a new supplier. And then, of course, there's a core component with finance to be able to do the planning, forecasting, and other things as well. So, yes, I think in short, absolutely, but it's going to rely on bringing in very different parts of the business and creating that cross-functional collaboration.
Yeah. So just conscious of the time, Dheev, and looking to start to wrap this up, I'd like to get your final thoughts around what you see as the future around these legacy source-to-pay, source-to-contract platforms. Because we've got Valdera looking at chemicals and raw materials. We've had previous guests on the show, Gregory and Marcus from Padua, which is a professional services specific sourcing platform. Peter Kynes, way back in the beginning in 2020 when we launched the show, that does his platform does freight procurement. And then you've got the intake and orchestration tools that are snapping at the heels and taking market share off some of these legacy suites as well. Do you see this model as being fundamentally dead, or do you think that now if we're going to be communicating through an LLM and they have an MCP server that's able to then connect via APIs to some of this legacy tech, do you still think they might survive and thrive in that environment?
Absolutely. I think the key here is that you have to take a different verticalized approach for different categories. And this is a nice full circle to the topic that we started with, because I think this is the shift from seeing horizontal software that works really well on the indirect side to moving towards much more of verticalized software that works extremely well for specific categories, whether that's professional services, whether that's MRO, whether that is marketing, whether that is other indirect categories, whether that's direct finished goods, or whether that's chemicals and raw materials in our case. So from our perspective, we don't see this as a winner-take-all, one-size-fits-all model. We see this as a deeply integrated vertical workflow for specific categories, because the way that you manage chemicals and raw materials should be very different than the way that you manage professional services or marketing or travel or other categories.
Yeah, I completely agree. And then finally, Dheev, what would be the one thing that you would recommend to procurement teams about the way that, how would you recommend that they change the way that they perceive procurement technology today?
I think my big push typically is, hey, start small, prove the value, and scale up, right? I think, I've seen so many different technology roadmaps across many customers. And, if you look at our customer base and the folks that are moving extremely quickly versus others that are boiling the ocean to figure out the perfect solution before they move, I think the folks that are extracting the quickest value and moving the fastest are the ones that are starting small, proving the value across a specific bucket, saying, hey, we now have built a case. Let's go expand. Let's go, iterate on more categories. Let's go bring in a bigger part of the team. It's that start small and slowly expanding over time that is driving the biggest value. I think the biggest failure mode that I'm seeing is trying to get to that perfect 100% solution up front where they say, okay, great, I want to integrate with 10 different applications. I want to do this across, $3 billion in spend, and this is going to be a multi-million-dollar transformation. That's not where we're seeing the biggest impact. It's where we're starting with a small scope with a very clear success criteria and defined metrics, proving that value and slowly expanding that, bringing in those integrations over time and expanding across a bigger part of the spend.
Yeah, and if you're an ex-consultant, you'd understand this, but what's in the top right-hand corner of that quadrant in terms of high impact but low disruption or lowest possible cost? Yeah, absolutely.
You're spot on, right? Because there's low-hanging fruit that you can start with, prove the value, and then scale up from there. And oftentimes, the hardest part is getting started and creating that initial use case.
Yeah. Okay, Dheev, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Final question, and this is a really easy one for you to answer. If people would like to learn a little bit more about Valdera, where's the best place that they can get in touch?
Please reach out. We'd be excited to chat with you. We have a ton of information and some exciting case studies on our website. Please reach out to me directly. We'd love to connect, share a little bit more about what we're building and get your feedback.
And that will all be in the show notes, the links to Dheev's profile and to Valdera's website as well, if you're listening to this on the fly and want to check them out. Dheev, pleasure. Thanks very much for joining me. And best of luck in your expansion to EMEA, which I hear is well in swing now.
Thanks for having me, James. Great conversation.
Okay, that was Dheev talking about chemicals and raw materials sourcing. Hope that was useful. As someone who started out in that space, in the direct spend sphere, it's always great to bring someone on in a category that's really very underrepresented still in 2026, but I think that is definitely going to change. Huge thanks again if you're listening to the show. We appreciate you. There are a lot of procurement podcasts out there, so we're especially grateful that you've chosen to listen to us today. Don't forget, if you want to get our tech maps, they are also linked in the show notes, completely free to download over at our digital store. We will catch you again, same time next month. Until then, take care wherever you are, and bye for now.